This is TLC to go.
All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving into something that's, well, pretty core to what everyone listening does every single day. Student assessment in health sciences education. We've got some great information here from the UTHSE Teaching and Learning Center website, which is awesome because, this isn't like old dusty theories. This stuff was just reviewed in February, so we know it's up to date.
Yeah, definitely. We're talking about practical, current, and super relevant approaches to help you, guide your students and do that assessment really effectively.
Absolutely. So our goal in this deep dive is to really pull out those key strategies, the real actionable teaching tips when it comes to assessing your students. So think of it as getting the most important insights without getting bogged down in a ton of theory.
Okay.
So, first things first. Why is assessment even so critical in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point. At its heart, assessment serves a vital purpose. It gives us, as educators, a clear picture of how well our students are meeting those learning goals and objectives that we set for them.
Right.
But also, it's important to note that it's not just about those big exams at the end of a course. The UTHSC resource talks about both formal and informal assessment.
Yeah, and what is the real difference in practice?
Well, when most of us think about assessment, we immediately picture formal assessments. Things like exams, quizzes, those graded assignments that carry significant weight.
Right, the traditional tests and papers.
Right, exactly. But informal assessments, on the other hand, are a bit different. They're more integrated into the everyday flow of teaching. So think about those in-class discussions you lead. Maybe you have students do a quick 1-minute paper to check for understanding during a lecture, or even using a quick poll to see where the class stands on a certain concept.
I see. So it's more about those kind of in-the-moment check-ins.
Yeah, exactly. It's like taking the temperature of the class in real time.
I like that. What are maybe some unexpected benefits you've seen when faculty really utilize those types of checks?
One of the coolest things about informal assessment is the immediacy of the feedback. Right. The UTHSC resource actually really emphasizes this. How frequent assessment, both formal and informal, really empowers you as the instructor. If you can spot a misconception or a point of confusion early on through a quick informal check, then you have the power to adjust your teaching right then and there.
Right.
Instead of, finding out much later on in a high-stakes exam that, half the class missed this key concept.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's almost like you have constant course correction data available to you.
Exactly.
Now, the resource also explores something called the 10 Maxims of Formative Assessment.
Yes.
And that sounds like a really useful framework. What's the core idea behind that?
This framework, which was highlighted by researchers Prashanti and Ramnarayan, really digs into how to make formative assessment really impactful. And, just as a reminder, formative assessment is all about assessing during the learning to actually guide and improve it, not just evaluating at the end. So these 10 maxims, and I know it sounds like a lot, but they're actually pretty easy to grasp. They're essentially 10 key principles to keep in mind when designing and implementing your formative assessments.
Okay, so what are those 10 maxims?
The 10 maxims are faceless, facilitates learning, feedback, feed forward, focus on learning, flexibility, fast, frequent, friendly, and fun.
Okay, 10 is a good number to aim for.
Yeah.
Can we unpack a couple of these? What does it mean for an assessment to be, for example, faceless in this context?
Faceless in this context really means designing assessments in a way that minimizes any potential bias that might be related to a student's identity. So essentially, the goal is to focus purely on the quality of their work.
That's interesting.
And, while complete anonymity might not always be practical, especially depending on the type of assessment you're doing, the underlying principle here is to reduce as much as possible any unconscious biases that we might have as instructors that could influence how we perceive a student's understanding at that formative stage.
I see. So it's really about kind of, leveling the playing field and just looking at the work itself.
Right.
Now, feed forward was specifically mentioned in the resource as being really important. How does that differ from just regular feedback?
Yeah, feed forward is super interesting. And what's really key with feed forward is that it shifts the focus from simply pointing out what a student got wrong.
Okay.
And instead, it's about actively guiding them on how to actually improve in the future. The Advances in Physiology Education article that's cited in the UTHSC resource really emphasizes this point. Students get feedback, yes, But the crucial element with feedforward is that clear direction on how to take that information and actually apply it to upcoming learning and tasks. So it's not just about seeing a red mark on a past assignment, but it's about being empowered with that roadmap for future success.
Right. So it's less about a postmortem and more about, a proactive strategy.
Exactly. Exactly.
Now, the UTHSC resource also talks about a really, really relevant issue for, I think, probably everyone listening, which is maintaining academic integrity, especially when so much learning and assessment happens online these days.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge.
What are some of the key strategies that they highlighted?
The resource points to a few research-supported approaches that have been shown to be pretty effective. For example, offering open notes assessments can sometimes change the dynamic of the assessment itself, shifting the focus from pure recall to application of knowledge.
Makes sense.
Another strategy is using watermarks on your assessment materials,
Right.
which can actually act as a deterrent against, unauthorized sharing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have timed exams, which remain a really common method to limit the time available for students to, maybe try to look up answers or get help from outside sources.
Yeah, that's helpful for those more traditional kind of online exam formats.
Yeah.
What about other types of assessments?
Right. Well, the resource also highlights the importance of what we call authentic assessment techniques. So think about assignments like papers, projects, case studies, tasks that require students to apply their knowledge in a more meaningful, complex way that makes it much harder to simply look up the answers.
Right.
And of course, we can't forget about the role of monitoring software like ProctorU or Respondus, which some institutions are using to oversee online exams. There's actually a really great Journal of Chemistry Education article that's referenced in the resource that provides a deeper dive into all of these strategies, so I would definitely recommend checking that out.
Sounds like a multi-layered approach is probably the most effective way to go.
Definitely.
Now, let's move on to some really practical teaching tips for assessment. The UTHSC resource outlines 4 key areas to focus on. The first is really all about using formative assessments themselves. What are some really concrete ways that faculty can do this effectively in their courses?
The resource defines formative assessments as those frequent low-stakes evaluations that are designed specifically to guide learning.
Okay.
And it gives some really great examples like brief quizzes. We're not talking about high-pressure, stressful exams here, just quick checks to see if students are grasping those key concepts.
Right.
Another great strategy is using polling tools, something like Poll Everywhere, during a lecture, to get real-time feedback on student understanding. And even a well-structured, graded in-class discussion where you as the instructor are actively listening for those specific concepts that you're trying to teach can function as a really valuable formative assessment. What comes to mind for you?
I think for me that low-stakes aspect is so key because it really reduces student anxiety and makes the assessment much more about the learning process itself rather than, just a performance evaluation.
Absolutely.
The resource also mentioned using formative assessment as a way to kind of scaffold larger projects.
Right.
Like providing feedback on a research proposal draft before the final submission.
Right.
Which I think is a really effective way to kind of build that understanding incrementally.
Yeah, definitely.
The second tip is about combining summative and formative assessments. How do these work best together in a course?
Well, this is about creating a really well-rounded assessment strategy. Summative assessments, as the resource points out, are those higher stakes evaluations. Think your final exams, major research papers, end-of-unit tests, things like that. They're designed to evaluate overall learning against the established learning goals for the course. And the real power of combining them with formative assessments is that those formative assessments give you those ongoing feedback loops, and they give the students those opportunities to learn and improve before they actually face those higher stakes summative evaluations. So think of it as a continuous cycle of feedback and improvement that ultimately leads to better performance on those more significant assessments.
So the formative assessments are essentially building that foundation for success on the summative one.
Exactly. And it's not an either situation, It's really about understanding how they complement each other to best support student learning throughout an entire course or module.
I see. And the third practical tip focuses on the development and use of rubrics. Why are rubrics such a valuable tool in assessment?
Oh, rubrics. I know so many of us use them, but the resource really emphasizes how crucial they are for ensuring consistent grading
Right.
and making those expectations totally clear to our students from the outset. It really takes away that ambiguity
Yes.
about what constitutes successful work, both for us as graders and for the students as they're working on the assignment.
It's so true. That clarity is key. Rubrics really provide that transparent framework
Yeah.
that outlines the specific criteria and, the different levels of performance for an assignment. So not only does this lead to fairer and more consistent grading across different students, but it also really empowers students to understand exactly what you're looking for and how their work is going to be evaluated. The USF Health Rubric tutorial, which I know was mentioned in the resource, is a great place to start for faculty who are looking for more guidance on creating those effective rubrics.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great resource. And then finally, the fourth practical tip is all about aligning your assessments with your learning goals.
Right, which seems so fundamental.
It is absolutely fundamental and so critical. The resource really stresses that your assessment methods should directly reflect those learning objectives that you've established for your course. So you really have to ask yourself, what specific skills and knowledge do I want my students to have by the end of this course or by the end of this unit or this module? And then your assessment should be designed in a way that provides them with clear opportunities to actually demonstrate those specific skills and that knowledge. And the resource gives this really helpful concrete example. Let's say one of your learning objectives is for students to be able to describe a particular physiological process. Well, your assessments should then include opportunities for them to do exactly that, whether it's through an essay question, an open-ended quiz item, or even having them give an oral presentation.
It seems so obvious when you say it like that, but it's easy to fall into that trap of just using, the assessment methods that we're familiar with without really thinking about that direct link back to what we really want students to be able to do.
Yeah.
And I think the Georgia Tech Classroom Assessment Techniques page and Kibble's Advances in Physiology Education article on best practices for summative assessment, both referenced in the resource, likely offer some really valuable insights into how to make sure that alignment is strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have some really great concrete strategies. So just to kind of summarize everything we've talked about, we've explored why assessment is so important in the first place, right? Looking at both those formal and informal approaches.
Right.
We delved into those 10 maxims of formative assessment, highlighting that really important concept of feed forward. We talked about the ever-present challenge of maintaining academic integrity in online settings, and we touched on some of those evidence-based strategies that can help. And then finally, we really dove into those practical teaching tips that the UTHSE resource highlighted, using formative assessments effectively, combining them with summative assessments, designing really good rubrics, and always making sure that your assessments are aligned with your overall learning objectives for the course.
Absolutely. And, for all of you health sciences faculty listening, these are really practical, actionable insights. I mean, these are concrete ways that you can think about how to enhance your teaching and ultimately lead to better learning outcomes for your students as they, progress on their journey to becoming healthcare professionals.
And this actually leads to a really important question for you to consider as you move forward. What's one new formative assessment technique that you could try integrating into your next course? Or maybe, take a moment to think about how well your current assessments really reflect the learning objectives that you've set for your students.
That's a good point.
Could even a small shift in your assessment strategy make a really big difference and lead to a much deeper and more meaningful grasp of the material for your students in their specific health sciences discipline?
It's definitely something worth thinking about.
It is.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dives. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the world of health sciences education.
See you next time.